So the last couple of functions that we've talked about, COUNTIF and SUMIF, both have been able to let us do something that is based on a criteria or a condition, right? Only count cells in this range that meet a certain criteria, right? Only count cells in this range that are greater than 50, right? Then we looked at SUMIF. Please add together cells in a range that meet a criteria. Or in this case with all three arguments, look at this range of cells. When you find cells in this range that meet the criteria, jump to the next range and add those, right? But it all has to do with doing something based on a criteria. So we have counting and adding. If you look around in some of the help articles, you'll see that there are some of the other functions we've talked about that also, I'll say it this way, have an if variety to them. I saw one earlier today that was like average if. Right? So only average the cells together if they meet a criteria, what have you. Wouldn't it be useful if we could do other things, other tasks, based on a conditional statement other than just counting and adding? What if I wanted to do other things? And of course, the answer to this question is this would be really great. If we could start to let the spreadsheet do a lot of different things based on a condition or a criteria. So we're going to have the next function to look at, which is that will allow us to basically do almost anything based on a criteria, not just adding and not just counting. Okay, so we have COUNTIF and we've had SUMIF. Now I'd like to look at a function called if. It's just if. If is going to allow us to make a comparison. If the comparison is a true statement, I want you to do one task. If the comparison is a false statement, do some other task. Okay, so this is going to really open up our abilities to be able to do almost anything we want based on a comparison statement. We'll show you what the function looks like here, and we're going to give you a lot of examples of the things you could do with if. Once you kind of see how it generally works, you can start to make the if functions we write very simple, or they can actually really start to get pretty complicated. So this could be a very powerful function, the if function. Okay, so let me maybe put this into some context and give you an example. Okay, here are the arguments that this function needs. The way that we're going to use the if function, we are going to always include 3 pieces of information. Right, so far we've seen 2 with COUNTIF, but we've also seen 3 with SUMIF. So in this case, all 3 of them, I'm going to ask you, you have to have all 3 of these arguments for this function to work. So the name of the function is if, just if. Okay. Then the first argument is going to be what the Sheets calls the logical test. This is some statement that uses a comparison operator. And I'll show you some examples here in a second. It has to be a statement that ultimately is going to evaluate to true or false, right? So we're going to have to use comparisons like greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than or equal to, those types of things. Okay. So whatever we do here, this function has to be this test here, this statement is going to have to be able to ultimately be evaluated to be, is that true or is it false? If the value in the logical test, if the statement we write here is a true statement, I want you to jump to the second argument and do whatever it says there. So this is what I'll call the value if true. What are we going to do if the logical test is a true statement? And then the third argument is, well, if the logical test is a false statement, I would like you to jump to the third argument and do whatever it says there. Okay. So here are your 3 arguments. First is the logical test, some sort of a comparison statement. what do we, evaluate this statement. If this statement is true, jump to the second argument and do whatever it says there. If the logical test is a false statement, jump to the third argument and do whatever it says there on the value of false. Okay? So there's always going to be some test using a comparison operator. What do I do if it's true? And what do I do if it's false? Okay? So here are your three arguments. And again, hopefully as we show you some examples, this will start to make a little bit more sense before we let you play and go to town. Okay, so those are your three arguments for the if function. Just a reminder for you, the comparison operators, we saw these when we started to talk about SUMIF and COUNTIF. The comparison operators are going to be necessary, especially when we're trying to write the logical test. They're going to have to involve some sort of a comparison, like greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, not equal to, or equal to. Just remember how we're going to do that with Excel or with sheets in your spreadsheet, especially when it comes to the greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, not equal to. These are just a little different than we're used to seeing. Okay, so just a refresher on the comparison operators. These are the exact same operators we saw when we talked about SUMIF and COUNTIF. Okay, so let's first talk about the logical test. What can you write in the first argument? I'm going to give you a bunch of examples here. Okay, we really do have a lot of flexibility. Okay, so maybe we could do something like this. And I'm only going to show you the logical test in this particular case. So this is an incomplete function. So what if we did something like this? If A1 is greater than 20, right? So look at the value in A1, and if that value in A1 is greater than 20, right? So there's the comparison. So we could compare a cell to a value. So maybe you'd write that. If this was a true statement, we'd jump over to do whatever it said in value of true. If this was false, if A1 was not greater than 20, we would jump over and do whatever it said in value of false. Okay. So if some cell is greater than a value, okay, we could do this. If A1 is greater than B1, we could compare one cell to another cell. Great. All right. So as long as you're using a comparison statement, a comparison operator, and really you have something on both sides of the comparison operator, it's probably going to be okay. All right. So what if we compare the value in this cell to the value of that cell? If the value of A1 is greater than B1, that would be true. If it's not, it would be false. Here's where we're going to start to be a little bit more complicated. You could, as part of the logical test, write a larger formula calculation and ask if the entire calculation is greater than or less than a number. So in this case, I want the formula is actually going to add together the value in A1 and C3. If the sum of those two numbers is less than or equal to 30, there's the comparison. Is the sum of these two numbers less than or equal to 30? Okay, so you could actually compare a formula to a value. We could also compare a formula to a cell. So if A1 plus C3 is not equal to D9, there's the comparison. Is A1 plus C3 not equal to D9? Okay, so we could compare a formula to a cell value. And here's the big one. What if we wrote another function in the middle of this comparison statement? What if the sum of A1 through C8, what if we added all those numbers together? Is that sum less than 100? Okay, so we have a lot of flexibility. We can put a lot of functionality into here. We have very, very simple comparisons, and then we have much more complicated comparisons down here. You could really build some pretty wacky stuff down here, quite honestly, which could be really, really powerful and really interesting. Okay, so these are maybe some examples of what the if logical test could be. Okay, so that's step one. We have to figure out what is the comparison that's going to cause us to do something. Okay, so when you do it, make sure that you do use a comparison operator. Okay, you have to have a comparison operator in this statement somewhere. Okay, so that's what the logical test could look like. What could the value of true and value of false look like? I'm going to put one slide up that will show you some examples of what you can do, because you basically can do the exact same types of things for both true and false. Okay. So here are some complete if functions. But I want to focus on what can you do as the value of true, value of false. First, you could put wherever you write this if function is where something is going to be put into that cell. Right. So if I wrote this if I wrote this formula in cell B8, whatever I do here will show up in B8. Okay. So maybe I want to have a message show up in the cell. I just want some text to show up in the cell. You could do that, right? And in whatever text you want to have show up in the cell, just make sure you put it inside of quotes. Okay. So the way that this particular if function reads, it says, if the value in A1 is greater than 20, if that's true, I want you to put in the cell great. If this is a false statement, if A1 is in fact not greater than 20, I want you to put in not great. Okay, so you can make text show up in the cell. And all you have to do is whatever message you want to have show up there, just put it inside quotes. Okay, so here's an example of, here's a test. If this statement winds up being a true statement, do what it says in the second argument. If this is a false statement, do what it says in the third. Okay, so you can make text show up in the cell. You could make a number show up in the cell. I don't know, I'm calculating your test grade, and I want to see if how many bonus points do you get on the test, right? So if A1 is greater than B1, if this statement is true, I want you to just display 25 in the cell. If this statement is a false statement, I want you to display 15 in the cell. Okay, if you just put a number here with no quotes and nothing, it's just going to take that number and put it in the cell for you. Okay. Now we could, as the value of true, value of false, let it perform a calculation. Interesting. Whatever the logical test happens to be, I just grabbed the ones from the last screen, but whatever the logical test happens to be, if this is a true statement, I want you to perform this calculation in the cell. So we would actually go grab the value from A1 and add 5 to it, and then give you A1 plus 5 in the actual cell where you wrote the formula. If this is a false statement, I want you to go and only add 3 to the value in A1. Interesting. So we can have it perform another calculation right here in the middle of the function. One thing to note is that you, even though I didn't put the equal signs in the front here, you only need one equal sign when you want to start the function. Because we are putting, normally if you were just writing A1 plus 5 in its own cell by itself, you'd have to do equals A1 plus 5. You don't need another equal sign here, and you don't need another equal sign here, because the equal sign at the beginning would have already started the function working. Okay, so don't put another equal sign here or here. Okay. You could go grab you a value from somewhere else on the spreadsheet. Right? So the way that this reads is, if this statement is a true statement, I want you to go get me the value in F8 and put the value from cell F8 in the cell. If this statement is a false statement, I want you to jump over to cell F9 and get me the value from over there. Right? So the value of true, value of false could just say, go get me the value from another cell. And if you just want to just name the reference for the cell, and it will go out, grab you that value and put it in. Okay. And here's the kicker. Here's the really complicated one. We could actually have the if function go out and perform another function. Again, it doesn't matter right now what the logical test is. If this is a true statement, I want you to go, if that's true, I want you to go get me the average of these cells. Go perform the average. It'll go calculate the average and give you back the answer, the actual average. If this was a false statement, it would go find me the largest value in A1 through C8. All right. This is really cool. Right? So that we could literally almost do anything you want inside of an if function. If you're really following me, this is kind of cool. Watch how many functions there are in this one formula here. One line of code we wrote an if function, we have a sum function, an average function, and a max function, all being used in one cell. That's kind of cool. Right, so again, we're going from very simple things up here to things that are a little bit more complex to a lot of complexity here. Okay? What's the takeaway from this? The 3 arguments to an if function. First, there's some logical test. There's some comparison statement. If this is a true statement, do whatever it says in the second argument. If this is a false statement, skip and go to and do whatever it says in the third argument. If it's a really simple statement, great. If it's a much more complex statement, that's great too. But at the end of the day, it really has to do with what's the logical test. If that test is true, do what it says in the second argument. If the test is false, do what it says in the third. Okay. Here are some examples of what that could look like. Right, so we'll walk through a couple of examples actually using a spreadsheet. Okay. So maybe this is the spreadsheet you're working with. Okay, and here's the if function we wrote in some other cell. Great. If A2 is greater than 95, I want you to put present in the cell. If it's not, if it's false, I want you to put coal in the cell. Maybe this is Santa trying to decide if you deserve a present or coal in your stocking. Okay, so here's the logical test, value of true, value of false. Okay, so ultimately, this logical test evaluates to this. Is 90 greater than 95? Is that true or false? 90 is not greater than 95, so this is a false statement because A2 is not greater than 95. Okay, so because this is a false statement, we're going to skip over the value of true and do whatever it says in the third argument. So what would be the result of this function, this formula, this function? It would say coal in the cell. Is that okay? Evaluate this statement. If the statement is true, do what it says in the second argument. If it's false, do what it says in the third. Another example. If C3 is greater than B3, right? So if C3, 50, is greater than B3, 26. Is C3 greater than B3? Is 50 greater than 26? Yes, it is. Okay, so that's true. So what I want you to do is go and get me the value from D1. D1 says pen. It will actually do what it says in the second argument. So it actually would display pen in the cell. Okay, hopefully you're seeing the pattern here. Do whatever, make this comparison. If this comparison is true, do what it says in the second argument. If it's false, do what it says in the third. Okay. So the next example, if A1 is less than 90, great. A1, in this case, is 22. Is 22 less than 90? Yes, it is. So this is a true statement. This is true. So what I want you to do is go and do whatever it says in the second argument, which in this case says take the value in A2 and add 5 to it. So take the value in A2, that's 90. Oh, that's a mistake. Take the value in A2, that would be 90, plus 5 would give you an answer of 95, not 27. That's a mistake on my part. All right, but it's going to actually go find the value in A2 and add 5 to it and give you back the answer. Okay. And here's the more complicated one. Okay. But again, even though there's a lot going on here, it's all the same idea. Okay. The logical test. We're going to compare this statement. Is A1 plus A3 greater than C2? A1 is 22. A3 is 43. So 43 plus 22 gives you 65. Okay. And C2 is 73. Okay. So is 65 greater than 73? In this case, no, it's not. So it's not going to try to find me the largest value in A1 through A3. It's going to go calculate me the average of all the numbers in A1 to A3. Do this. Ultimately, that's what you'd see in your cell. So it's the exact same concept, no matter how complicated the if function is. Look at the logical test. Do the comparison. If the comparison is true, do whatever it says in the second argument. If the comparison is false, do whatever it says in the third. That's why it doesn't matter how complicated or weird or wacky the value of true, value of false are. Doesn't matter. Just go do whatever it says in the value of true argument if this is in fact a true statement. If it's a false statement, do whatever it says in the third. All right? If is super powerful. We can do a lot of really interesting things with this if function. All right, we're going to give you some time to practice with this and get a feel for it. Work with it a little bit before we ask you to do some more stuff with it. So in the next video, I'll give you some directions on maybe how to play with this, and then we'll give you a bunch of stuff to be able to explore and to look at and see what types of if functions could you possibly create.